and I am a member of the ADLM CLS Council who is putting on this event today. To get us started, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the ADLM CLS Council and what we do. First of all, let's do a little couple of housekeeping items. If you could all make sure to place yourself on mute for a majority of the presentation, that would be great. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will have some time at the end for questions to be answered. For those of you who are not familiar with the CLS Council, our goal is to guide ADLM's activities and programs to address the professional needs of ADLM's current and prospective clinical laboratory scientist members. We lead the CLS perspective to broad ADLM programs and oversee targeted activities to engage and involve ADLM's clinical laboratory scientist members. The CLS Council contributes to identifying topics and areas of interest, makes program recommendations, and seeks input from the CLS constituency by providing content and advises on strategies to expand ADLM's membership. Some of our biggest priorities include increasing awareness of CLS and providing networking opportunities across laboratories throughout the United States. We also want to make sure that we are promoting the CLS profession. We offer many resources and educational opportunities. So you'll see a picture here of our webpage where those are available to you. And upcoming this July at the 2024 ADLM Scientific Meeting, we'll be offering a special CLS Day where you will have access to over 20 conference sessions, scientific abstracts, and an opportunity to visit the Clinical Lab Expo. If anybody has any interest, please feel free. We have a QR code there you were able to scan. And then if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Casey Peterson. She's our CLS Chair Council, or Jordan Bradford, who is our CLS Council Liaison. So to get started with our panel discussion today, I want to thank our panelists for joining us and also welcome Cheryl Haskins, who will be helping moderate the presentation.
Hey, thank you, Leslie. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists. First, we have Elizabeth Champion-Lyons, who is an MLS. She's a chemistry specialist at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, South Carolina. She has been at MUSC for 12 years and has been a lead for chemistry for 10. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Raven Stewart is currently the Laboratory Quality Director for Baylor Scott and White Health in Dallas, Texas. She has 18 years of clinical laboratory experience, the last 9 of which have been dedicated to laboratory quality management. Welcome, Raven.
Thank you. Hi.
And Tarina Yamamoto is currently at UCSF Health in San Francisco as a lab manager. She specifically oversees the QA of 6 clinical labs, which includes 3 transfusion services and 2 cellular therapy sections. By trade, she's a clinical laboratory scientist with specialty in transfusion medicine. Welcome, Tarina.
Nice to see everybody.
And I'm very happy that all 3 of these clinical laboratory scientists have rejoined us for what turns out to be part 2 of our training and competency virtual webinars. We had last spring, we had a session on what should be on your training checklist, and we're following that up with what should be on your competency assessment. The training checklist webinar is available on the ADLM website, and I think we're going to have a link to that available in the chat at some time during this. So if you want to follow up and go back to the training, that is available for at least several more months. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll jump right into our questions. Our first question is going to go to all of our panelists, and that is a training checklist versus a competency assessment. What does that mean in your lab, and how do you differentiate those 2 things in your onboarding? Tarina, we got your picture up first, so you want to start that?
Sure. That's always great to start a simple question as that. I'm sure it's going to be all similar with all three of us. But basically, your training checklist is usually a step-by-step process of a procedure or a task that you're trying to show either a new employee or an existing employee where we actually changed the task. So it's just a step-by-step. The competency usually happens after training, and it's really to assess that everything that you have trained the staff, that they have brought the knowledge and the know-how of what to do to make sure that all the tests is done correctly and safely.
Hey, that's great. Raven, do you have more to add to that?
Yeah, I would completely agree with everything that was just said. You know, training is something that we do prior to beginning patient testing. You know, before we're working independently, we're going to document. It's me very specific, very step by step. Often we're using a checklist that's been provided potentially by a vendor for a certain analyzer. And then competency assessment, I like to lovingly kind of refer to as a checkup, right? So we've done our training, and competency assessment is really confirmation of the person's ability to apply the skills and the knowledge that they obtained during training. Is that's what we're checking basically during competency assessment.
Okay, Elizabeth, how are things approached in your laboratory?
Pretty similar to what everybody else said. Our training checklist is extremely in-depth for chemistry. It's a physical copy that we give to each new care team member that comes on. And then the competency assessment is in Media Lab. That is just a very broad overview of each topic that corresponds with the CLS CMS competency assessment checklist. There's 6 procedures for their competency assessment. And then we also have some practical events that we check off, like we check that they have done a CAP survey. We check that they're able to process a needle stick exposure appropriately, that we check off that they can properly call a critical result, those kinds of things.
Okay, great, thank you. Raven, this next question is for you. How do you determine if competency assessment is required for testing in your laboratories? And I guess the parallel to that is, are there things that you can't actually competency assess or don't have to, or maybe get included in a bigger picture?
Yeah. So really, to determine whether a competency assessment is required, this is for test systems, right? So you've got to determine what is a test system. So a test system is anything that puts out a result or a set of results. So certain tasks do not require, at least from a CAP accreditation perspective. I live in the state of Texas. All of the labs that I support are accredited by the College of American Pathologists. So that's sort of my background in terms of how I'll answer this question and others today. If it is not producing a result, you do not have to do competency assessment for it. So things like phlebotomy, sometimes we get questions and people say, oh, do I need to do competency assessment for phlebotomy? It's not a test system in the eyes of CLIA and CAP. So technically, no, you do not need to do competency assessment. If you are building a competency assessment program, I would say the most important thing to understand is defining appropriately your test systems. And so again, it's anything that produces a test result. It could be manual or it could be automated, right? So we have manual test systems, maybe a manual differential. You could be doing, an automated test system. So a CBC analyzer, that's a test system. And so competency does have to be assessed for all test systems. It's important to understand that chemistry or hematology is not a test system. Those are departments within our laboratories. And within one of those departments, you're going to have probably multiple test systems, right? So in hematology, you're going to have that CBC analyzer. You're going to have manual differentials. You might have SED rates. All those are test systems within that department of the lab. And then, of course, depending on whether it's waved versus non-waved, you get into whether we have to assess all 6 elements or not. But the first thing you have to really answer is, does it put out a result? And therefore, it is a test system. So it does have to have competency assessed.
Okay, I was thinking as you were saying that, so like for our giant chemistry analyzers that do so many tests now, is there anything that would be considered a subsystem that would need separate competency?
Yeah, and that's a great question. That's a great clarifier. So in general, they make it a little bit easier for us in that we can say that chemistry analyzer is a test system. However, if there's something different about a test or a subset of tests that it requires like maybe pre-treatment of the sample before it goes on the analyzer like everything else, that would be its own test system and would need to be assessed separately from the big analyzer.
Okay, great, thank you. When creating competency assessments, what key components must be included per CLIA, and are there any differences for those labs under CAP? Raven, maybe we'll start with you on that one, since you have identified that you use CAP for your accreditation in Texas.
Yep. So, from my understanding, there are no additional requirements from a CAP perspective. We follow the CLIA guidelines around competency assessment. And that really it's the 6 elements of competency, right? So it's the things like direct observation of patient testing, monitoring and reporting of test results, review of intermediate test results and periodic maintenance records, direct observation of instrument maintenance, assessment of test performance through proficiency testing or blind samples, and then the 6th element, which is evaluation of problem solving. And so for non-wave test systems, you have to unfortunately assess all 6 of those as applicable to the test system, right? So there might be an NA here and there for if it's not applicable to a test system, but you are required for non-wave to get to assess all 6 of those.
Okay, great. And Tarina, being in California, do you have different things that might need to come up, additional things for California?
It's basically what Raven said. It is true under CLIA, whenever there's a test, you do have to do the 6 elements to make sure you do that. The only difference I would say that in the CAP, this is actually fairly new, maybe about a year or 2 ago. In the transfusion services, they do require some kind of competency for all the critical processes. So those of you who are in blood bank or remember the blood bank, for instance, when you're processing, let's say you're washing blood, you're really supposed to be doing that competency on all those critical steps. So that's something new, and then we had to add that in. But at UCSF San Francisco, we also have an overarching policies of what we do for a competency. So we do require all of non-testing as well, because we wanted to make sure we also cover the pre-analytical, and then of course the testing is mostly analytical, and then the post-analytical is also testing, which is the results. So we also make sure that there's a competency, for instance, our laboratory assistant, I think that's what most of us call the non-licensed. So we include all of that, but that's really because that's our hospital policy for our laboratories. And under CLIA, it basically says you have to have a program for competency assessment. So probably in that program, you would define, what is it in your laboratory that you would do. But of course, minimally, you would have to at least follow the CLIA requirements of the 6 elements for all testing.
Thank you. Elizabeth, in your laboratory, do you have something similar to what Tarina described as something that kind of overarches everything else that's the regulatory agencies?
I'm trying to think. That's a good question. I don't think so. I think we're very just in our different little sections are all just have their own competencies. So we have own for hematology, own for chemistry, own for micro, because we don't have any generalist. Everybody works in their own area. You might be cross-trained in other areas, but if you are, you're then assigned those competencies in addition to your home-based competencies.
Right. Okay, great.
Hey, Cheryl, can I add to that? What Elizabeth is describing is exactly how UCSF started. Because it's so big, we specialize in every section. So unlike generalists that actually covers a lot, we have so many employees that specializes in chemistry, hematology, etc. So before I became the QA for them, that's exactly what I saw. And as a QA, I had a really hard time kind of controlling to make sure that we were standard. So what I'm describing was something that I kind of introduced to help bring that together. But by all means, what Elizabeth is describing is also acceptable.
So
I think they are working on trying to get some stuff streamlined through our quality department. We've had some turnover and new people coming into these positions. So I think they're trying to get everybody at least into Media Lab for their competencies and trying to get them all very similar to each other, even though we don't have anybody that are generalists, but trying to make everything a whole lot more streamlined for everybody. So the processes are the same.
yeah, and I imagine that there probably are processes for which you'd have a competency that you would use basically the same competency for hematology that you would for chemistry, for
Yeah.
how to handle a critical value, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, great. What credentials are required to be able to sign off on a coworker's competency assessment? Tarina, you want to handle that one?
Sure. Under CLIA, it basically has regulations that really talks about that a laboratory must have a competency program. So it's very system oriented. It's not those of us who are used to a CAP kind of, I wouldn't say prescriptive, but more like a outline of what should go into that program. So under CLIA, there's nothing specific other than the 6 elements for all testing. That's what's important for the CLIA. But of course, CLIA touches everything else. It goes into CAP, it goes into TJC, it goes into each of the states. Those of you who have the state regulations as well, because we have to make sure we include CLIA. So I'm going to talk specifically more about CAP because that is also what we're also accredited by. And CAP does get into that a little bit where there's a standard that talks about competency assessors must be identified or described on who can be those. So because of that, in our institution, we do have a policy or a procedure that talks about who can be qualified. Basically, what we say is that the person who is going to be identified as the competency assessor must at least have 2 years in that expertise. But we do allow that person to have that expertise outside of UCSF. For instance, if they were hired in as a supervisor and they've been in chemistry the last 6 years, we would allow that 1 year and then additional year in UCSF just so that they can learn the process that we have, and we would qualify them. So once we qualify them, we have a form that we say why we qualify them, and a lot of times they have to give us their resume in case we have to take those 2 years into account from another place that they had worked in. We file those. We have a separate form where we have our medical director sign off, basically that these are the people who are qualified. So we review that every year. And when I say we, I expect the sections to do it, and QA comes in and audits it, basically. So we do that. And of course, all the MDs basically under those areas are qualified, just like anything else they do as a technical supervisor, a technical consultant. Both these terms are in both CLIA as well as CAP that covers that. So they can also do it. But we rarely use our MDs because we know they're not probably I hope I don't have any MDs on this call. The best people to assess is usually going to be our supervisors, our senior soups, and we also have some of our specialists or people who've been there a long time who's willing to do it. So we do actually have a policy that really talks about that.
So is there not an exact educational requirement? Like if it was an MLT, a 2-year tech who had expertise in the area, they would still be available or allowed to fulfill that?
Yes, and I should probably preface it, in the state of California, in order to work as a CLS, you have to actually be licensed by the state of California. So by virtue of that, we already know what their background is. They have had a college degree. They have gone through the required courses at the state of California. They have gone through a 1-year training program, took the board exams for the state of California, which is equivalent to an ASCP today, pretty much. So, you know, so Cheryl, to answer your question, yes, those are the people who would have been qualified. So we added one extra layer where they had to have that specialty for at least 2 years, because we don't want someone from, say, hematology who just move over to chemistry to be able to do the chemistry portion of it unless they have an experience.
Right, right. So, all right, and I will apologize in advance, Raven. I'm coming to you. You mentioned that you sometimes have a checklist that comes from the vendor. If you're training on a new piece of equipment and the vendor representative has trained the staff, like a train the trainer, is it adequate to have the vendor sign off on that first person or first couple of people's training checklist?
So I don't want to conflate the two, the training and the competency, but
Oh, yeah.
but with training specifically, we do, you know, in some big installs, right? You may send somebody off to school, you know, within your lab, and they get signed off there by the vendor, and they come back and they train everybody. But you know, that doesn't happen all the time, right? If you just have some, you know, new analyzer, the vendor does come in, and we do allow, you know, they'll kind of maybe start with some key folks within a laboratory that they'll kind of train, and then we will then have, you know, our folks then go ahead and train our staff. And then for competency assessment, you know, we're using our own kind of homegrown, you know, forms that have, you know, the test systems on the top, and then the 6 elements and everything. And we're on paper today, but we're actually we just started the process of moving to an electronic vendor called Dossier. They're sort of new in that space, and so we're really excited about what that's going to bring us in terms of. You know, the biggest complaint I hear from people in terms of competency assessment is not the actual doing of it, it's the remembering when to do it. You know, you've got to do the 6 month and 6 month again, and then your annual and all that. And so when you start adding in hundreds of employees that you're kind of overseeing doing all this, it becomes really hard to manage. And so we're really excited that this product hopefully is going to help with tracking and then also transparency, right? So that anybody that has access to that system can come in and see it at one time. Where are we struggling? You know, where are we behind? Who is due next? That kind of stuff.
Oh, that's great. All right, and that's actually kind of a nice segue to my next question, which is going to Elizabeth. How do you keep track of your competency assessment? Is it paper or electronic? What are the pros and cons, and how much responsibility do you give to the tech to make sure that it gets done in a timely fashion?
So when I started, I think, you know, 12 years ago, it's very similar to a lot of places where everything was on paper, and you had all the procedures were printed out in notebooks, and you had to have people sign like the front page after they've read the procedure and that kind of stuff. But everything was on paper, so it would get lost, it would get thrown away, it would get ruined by a spill, something like that. So we switched to Media Lab, so we do everything electronically now. Which is really nice because you can set up everything is very customizable. So you can assign like a whole checklist to somebody, but you can mark not applicable for things that they might not be assigned to, or you can make, like, for example, we have like a checklist for chemistry that's for like our track area. We have one that's for our manuals bench. We have one that's for our instruments for our chemistry analyzers. And we can assign each one of those to the people as they go through each area, but not everybody that's trained in chemistry will be trained on all the chemistry benches. So they can just do parts of these. So, and then we also have lab assistants that get a very more limited chemistry checklist because they don't do any actual releasing of results. They're just working on like the track, and they're just loading and unloading samples and that kind of stuff. But you can also like set up quizzes in Media Lab, which is really nice, and that's what we use to assess the 6 month competency when that comes due. Also, the due dates are based on when they sign off their first one. So once they are onboarded, they have a certain amount of time to complete their competency. And then 6 months after that, it automatically assigns their 6-month competency. And then it's got quizzes that they take and we grade. And if we need to have them review anything, there's a way to put corrective action in there. And then there's a way to document that they've done a CAP survey and which survey they did and which analytes it covered and that kind of thing. But it also, Media Lab also assigns all the procedures to be read as well. So each employee will get assigned the procedures that are in Media Lab that are applicable to them, and they have to sign off that they read each one of those.
And then they get the automated reminders in their email saying you have
Yes.
stuff due, or you
Yes,
get a
and
little
then I get
icon in your
those
corner.
I get those reminders too, saying that they might be overdue or they're close to being due and that kind of thing. So, or I get a reminder that I have a quiz to grade or, things like that. So
That in itself is a huge benefit over a paper system.
for sure. It's like, I know everybody's on time.
Right, right. All right, thank you. This is going to go to all of you eventually. Let's start with Raven. How do you manage competency assessment for staff that work at more than one lab in your system, if you have that situation?
We do. We have that quite a bit. I support from at least a quality and accreditation perspective over 40 labs within our healthcare system. And whether we have people that are in a dedicated float pool, so we have some technologists who they are in a float pool, and so their job is to go they're assigned to different hospitals every day or week or whatever. And then we also just have in some cases where we've got sister hospitals that are real maybe even on the same campus, and those people will kind of pick up extra shifts back and forth. So this is fairly common. CLIA and CAP are very specific on the fact that competency must be assessed at the location where the testing is performed. Okay, so and this is for specifically non-wave testing. So if you are, working at lab A and you're working at lab B, and even if you're using the same exact CBC analyzer at lab A and lab B, you have to be assessed at both lab A and then again on that analyzer in lab B. So they're very specific that competency does have to be assessed per that CAP or CLIA number. You can store those records centrally, right? So that might make it easier to find them, but the assessment itself does have to take place at each individual laboratory.
Would that also apply if part of the assessment was like a quiz? If they did the quiz at one site, would the copy of the quiz be transferable to the other site, or do they have to do it all over again?
We personally have really interpreted that the stuff that has to be done on site is really kind of the direct observation pieces. So
Right.
if they're in things like the blind samples and stuff like that, so we do allow if we try to come up with standard quizzes and stuff so that anybody in the healthcare system that's using the CBC analyzer takes the same quiz for problem solving. And so we do allow, they take it once and then we use that in both, but the direct observation piece, the blind samples, all that kind of stuff, we do assess at the location.
Okay, good. Tarina, is that the same or different where you are?
So we have 6 different labs, and a lot of time one of the labs is short. So they're always asking me, can so-and-so, move down there and what would it take? That's always the question. Or for instance, if we have a strike year and, we have to go down in staff, same thing. Can these people help in this area? So basically, this deters them from moving people because this is exactly what Raven is talking about, because that's my belief also, that they have to be competency assessed in the lab that they're working at. So if they happen to work in 2 labs, and it doesn't matter if they went to the second lab only occasionally, they would also have to have their competency assessment in both laboratories. What we're trying to do is, I was really trying to, so right now, today, each of the CLIA numbers has their own set of SOPs, even though we might take all 6 and they're creating one SOPs, but we'll duplicate it 6 times. That's basically what happens. I'm trying to see, and I'm not sure if I could get away with this. Now I'm listening to what Raven is telling me. Trying to write a quality plan where we describe our system as actually one clinical laboratory, because certainly our medical directors, who has the expertise in those areas, actually covers more than one area. So if we write the quality plan, and they really do have one SOP, because currently we use master control as our document control, hopefully going to media lab in about 1.5 years. So I'm excited about that. Whenever we do have an SOP that is shared amongst all the sites, we do have each of the lab, CLIA lab directors sign off in each one. So you'll see our SOP with, for instance, 6 signatures. And hoping maybe in the future, we can do something like that, in which case then we can move the staff around a little bit more. But I would agree with Raven. I think the reason why the direct observations are done at each of the site is because the instrument might be a little different. They have their nuances of where they're putting things. So you just want to make sure everything works well. But today, exactly what Raven says, if we move a staff, they would have to have competency in the other labs as well.
Elizabeth, do you also have multiple laboratories within your system?
We do, and we are a regional hospital network as well. So we own several hospitals across South Carolina. And for our local labs that we do share employees between, it's easy in Media Lab to assign those competencies for those people that go over to those other labs, especially because the people that are going to those other labs, they have the same equipment that we have in our main lab. So it's very easy to assess competency in both places because they're already competent on the equipment here. It's not very hard to get them, to make sure they're competent at our other locations. We are in the process of streamlining a lot of our shared procedures between all of our hospitals across South Carolina. And that is very, very daunting of a task. But we're working on making some of the parts and some of our procedures a little bit more vague to include other places, or including footnotes for these other places, just so everybody is able to share our same, common procedures, because everybody is on Epic Beaker. Almost everybody is in the process of getting Architects and Sysmex instruments, that kind of thing. So we're all going to be on the same instruments, going to be using the same middleware, the same EMR software, all that kind of stuff. They already send a lot of their samples that they don't run in-house to us. So we do have, a lot more procedures than they do. But we are in the process of trying to get everybody on the same similar procedures.
All right, that sounds good. So, Raven, we're coming back to you next. What remedial action do you take when a competency has failed? And would the actions taken be different depending on which element of the competency was failed?
Yeah, so for me, this one is really situation dependent, right? To me, it really depends on, which element it was that failed, maybe even what part of that element failed. And so, for example, let's say it was problem solving, the 6th element, and let's say we're using a quiz. That's pretty common that people use a quiz to evaluate problem solving. And let's say by policy, you've set that they have to get an 80% or better to, basically pass. And so the person makes a 70. So you might look at that, see what did they miss, and then focus in on that and do some re-education. Maybe you want to review the procedure with them. I know you selected these two, this instead of this is why. So that one, it may be a little bit, easier. However, if let's say they fail the direct observation piece, right? That's, you're observing them do patient testing and you realize they flat out miss a step. They don't do the pre-treatment that they're supposed to do, before they put the analyzer on the sample on the analyzer. Maybe they use the wrong pipette. There's all these things that you should be looking for when you're doing that direct observation. And if they're failing that piece, then, more than likely you're going to have to do retraining. And say, okay, we're going to stop. We're going to go through, we missed this piece. And the biggest thing I tell people is if you are having to do reassessment and retraining for failed competency, please make sure you have appropriate documentation. That is the biggest thing that I can tell people, that, if you write down that they did not pass their competency, I want a lot of documentation on what you did with retraining, and then evidence of their reassessment, all of that. I don't want to just see a little note that says failed, because I'm going to want to see additional documentation.
As will the inspector when they show up.
Yes. That's where my mind is always going. Right? Somebody else is going to be looking at this, a year from now, and they're not going to know all the things that you probably did. So give yourself credit for it, save yourself the headache, document it all, and they may not even ask you about it.
That's right. But if they do, you'll be ready.
Yes.
All right. Tarina, when would you consider an annual competency to be overdue? Do you have a little grace period, or is it that day?
We do have a grace period. So basically your regulations and your standards says that when you have a new employee, you need to do it semi-annually and then annually thereafter. And usually what we do is we take the day that they complete training, found to be competent, so they can work by themselves, basically unsupervised. And that's the date that we go with. The CAP standards gives a little bit more directions, and their expectation is that you don't go past 7 months. So I can tell you, in our policy, we have written it where we allow semi-annual. So we're kind of describing what we mean by semi-annual, and it's going to be 6 months plus or minus 1 month. So we basically say from 5 to 7 months. It's just to give our staff a little bit of a leeway. I have not had a deficiency yet on the 5 months. But CAP basically says, not to exceed 7 months as kind of like their little suggestion. So that's what we have written in there. We try to follow that. So our annual would be very similarly 12 months plus or minus 1 month. So we let them go from 11 months to 13 months. And then we would consider that outside of the requirement if they don't follow that. And I was also told in the beginning, when we had inspectors come in from our CAP, I really didn't have that. I just had it a semi-annual and annual. And they were the one who kind of alerted me and said, you might want to do that because it'll give you a little bit of leeway. And it has worked really well for us in that respect. So that's what we've been doing. We also have written in there that if there is a staff that's been working, so it's not a new staff, and we bring in a new task or a new instrument or a new test, we will train them, find them competent, and they could follow their annual competency. So in other words, let's just say in 6 months was going to be their annual. We'll just pick it up at that time and it'll continue year after year like that. So, but we have that written in the policy and it's worked out well for us.
In general, if you have a policy that says what you do and you actually do it, you're probably going to be all right. You might get a suggestion that needs to be tweaked, but if you say what you do and do what you say, you're probably in good shape.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we touched on this very briefly before, but do you perform competency assessments on non-testing laboratory personnel? And if so, what do you use for criteria and assessment, and how do you document it? Elizabeth, you want to start that one?
Sure. So we have competency assessment for our clinical lab assistants. And we also have competency assessment for our central receiving area. Even though they are not testing personnel, they are receiving in everything for every area, including like after hours pathology and cytology samples. So they need to be aware of handling procedures and that kind of stuff for, you know, frozen sections that come in after hours for things that are not fixed. So we just set up a competency assessment for them so they can be aware of procedures they need to follow when they get kind of different things after hours. And then we also have a assessment for our lab assistants that generally only work in what we call our pour off area. So it's our area where things get delivered to that can't directly go on the track in its original form. So like bullet samples and glass tubes and that kind of stuff get delivered to our pour off area for processing before they're loaded on our track. So we do have a checklist for those people because there's maintenance for the track that is done. There's other like daily morning maintenance things. After second shift does maintenance as well, and then night shift does maintenance on the track. So we have, you know, competency that they're able to perform those tasks, and that they're able to process some of our send outs appropriately, because you know you have light protected send outs, you have send outs that have to go in metal free tubes, just to assess that they are competent in pouring off samples appropriately and delivering them to their appropriate areas.
All right, good. Raven, do you want to answer anything more on that?
Yeah, so in general, like at least from a corporate perspective, we do not require any of our non-testing personnel to go through annual competency. However, I am aware of several of our laboratories just at the local level that do this for things like phlebotomy, you know, so once a year, you know, that maybe they observe them, you know, do a couple of venipunctures, they'll observe them do blood culture collections, things like that. But at least from a corporate perspective, we don't have standard guidelines or, you know, standard forms or anything like that. But I do understand that a lot of laboratories, just like what Elizabeth described, they feel like that's a best practice. It may not be a requirement from an accreditation perspective, but they feel like it's a best practice for their laboratory.
Yeah, Torino, how is that handled in California?
So pretty much similar to what Elizabeth is talking about. It's not necessarily a California requirement. It's just happened to be our organizational policy for our clinical laboratories. So we do bring our lab assistants through a competency. We're not as stringent as the testing part where you have to do the 6-month and an annual and so on. We do allow them at least annually, so they probably do it once a year. So once they get trained, they find them competent, they'll go ahead and work independently, but then we have them on a cycle where they're actually testing them at least yearly. We don't go through the 6 elements. It depends what it is. They might want to do a DIR observation, or they may want to do just a quiz in general. So it's a little bit more relaxed. And then the only other area that I had mentioned before is the transfusion service, because for CAP, that is a fairly new requirement because we do have lab assistants in our blood bank helping us out with the manufacturing part, which is like your thawing of your FFP, you know, washing of some of this. No, they don't wash. I take that back. But they prepare things. So we do have that annual competency. But again, it's not as stringent as the testing. That is the required 6 months and then the annual and the 6 elements.
All right. I have a couple final questions. Excuse me. When the inspector comes around and wants to see your competency assessments, how do you provide that documentation? Tarina, you want to start there?
Sure, I can start. So unlike Raven and Elizabeth, where they have a kind of a more electronic, at least Raven is starting and Elizabeth seems to be established, ours is pretty much still on paper. So we have master control that probably can do some form of competency, but it's not a direct, easy way to do it. What we do is require some sections choose to make it a form number, so it's set into master control, and some still do their own paper. So what we do is basically have a master summary sheet for that section that describes the different ones that they have to do. And then they would go into the mass control form that actually goes into detail of how to do the competency. And then they would transpose that they've done it on this day, etc. So for the inspections, we basically show them the summary form for the staff that they have selected. Now, because CAP is kind of a peer inspection, they do sometimes ask us, can you show me what kind of quiz you do? So we do have that behind the scenes, but we don't put that necessarily as a packet because there's so many employees, virtually you're going to be missing a page or two. That's just how it works. So
Right.
we do require the summary page is basically what we show. There is no requirement, both in regulations from CLIA or from CAP, and I'm guessing from state as well as from TJC, where you actually have to show the detail. It's good to have because someone always wants to ask you about it. But you just have to be able to show that you have a system to do the competency. So we basically show the summary.
Okay. In Elizabeth, with an electronic system like Media Lab, what does the inspector get to see in your institution?
So they have a specific login for Media Lab for the inspectors, so they're able to log in and view everything. So they're able to see that everybody's competencies have been signed off. They are able to see if any of them were signed off after they were due, which we have had noted before on a inspection previously, which is, nice that it's, easy to tell if it's overdue or not, but also kind of like, oh, we should probably be a little bit more on top of that kind of thing. But yeah, they're able to log into Media Lab as kind of like an overview of lab services to be able to see all the competencies.
Okay, great. So I'm going to turn this over to Leslie Cooper, my colleague who's helping me with this. We have a few questions in the chat area. Leslie, if you are you able to come back on? Perfect.
Yep. All right, so the first question we have is, if an employee continuously fails competencies, how do you handle this? Is there a cutoff on how many times an employee can fail a competency?
Raven, how about you? You have that in your
Yeah, I was
area?
gonna say, I can take that. And so, I know at least for us personally at Baylor Scott & White, we do not have it, defined. Oh, you get 2 strikes and you're out. It's not that black and white. It's much more nuanced. I think we always want to give people, the tools that they need to do their job, to get the right results. But at the end of the day, we are taking care of patients. We are putting out patient results. And so there are times when we have had to, maybe we say, we don't do manual differentials anymore, like this staff member, but they can be really successful in chemistry or, another area of the laboratory. So we try to, see, is that an option? Sometimes that's not, right? Sometimes you're in a small laboratory, you're a generalist, you work by yourself, you got to be able to do manual differentials. And that's when sort of our friends from HR kind of come into to play there to say, this is a basic expectation that we have for this personnel, repeatedly through additional training. We've done, our part to really try to get them where they need to be. That's kind of where we start to have conversations with HR to say, we may need to, go a different direction than just limiting them to, one area.
Yeah, and Elizabeth, I think from my limited experience with using Media Lab, I think that it does tell you did not pass this. You need to try it one more time, or you only have one more time. Can you address that?
Yeah, so for like the quiz portions that the employee does, you get 2 attempts to get an 80 or above, and if you fail it that second time, it has to be intervened by myself or my other lead. We have 2 chemistry leads or the hematology leads. They either go in and reset the quiz again after talking to the employee, or they talk to the employee, figure out what retraining needs to be done, or if this is a constant problem, at that point, we would be sitting down with our manager and be like, is this something that you just aren't, like, what are you just not grasping, kind of things. Like, we want you to succeed, but we're also like Raven said, we're doing, like, this is real patient results. This is real stuff. So we want to make sure everybody obviously is very competent in what they're doing.
Yes.
But yeah, we just reset the quiz, after we've talked to them. They might have had like something silly happen. Like, I'm going to be very transparent right now. The last time I did my quizzes, I actually failed one of them. I was like very confident in my wrong answers. And I was like, I wrote these questions. How did I do this? But it's something just weird happened that day. I don't know if I just wasn't paying attention to what I was doing. I probably wasn't, but that kind of thing.
All right. Leslie, you want to bring our next question?
Yeah. For anyone using Media Lab for competency assessment, does anyone have any examples of checklists and how they are documenting the clear elements of assessment that they would be willing to share?
I have like a printout of my lab assistant checklist, but basically we set it up where each task on it is one of those of the 6 procedures, the 6 elements. So each task, like task 1 is the direct observation, and then underneath each task there's subtasks that might be like observed this thing, observe this thing, observe this thing, and then like monitor, like the next task is monitoring the recording and reporting of results. So that's going to be subtask, going to be calling criticals, calling hemolyzed specimens, resulting blood gases, that kind of thing. And then, task 3 is going to be review of intermediate test results. So we're going to check off that they did a proficiency CAP, like a CAP proficiency sample, or if they didn't get assigned one in a timely manner, then I'll do blind samples. And so I'll sign off, that'll be like the subtask for that. But yeah, we just set up each task to represent each of those 6 elements.
Okay, good.
All right. What type of grace period do you use for annual assessment if an employee is on an extended medical leave?
So I'll go ahead and answer that first. If their 1-year point or their annual falls into the time where they are on leave, then expectation is that when the employee comes back, they would have to be competency assessed before they can start working independently, basically. This is, of course, if their leave is more than, say, 3 months, we would also expect them to come back and get retrained before we go into competency. So there's a difference there because, if they're gone too long, and I think it's always good in policy to define what you consider a leave of absence, whether it's 2 weeks, which could be a vacation, right? Or 3 months, 6 months, you would have to make a decision like, yeah, I expect them to be retrained in those critical steps and then found to be competent before we would release them. It almost then can reset your competency timeline. Now, if they're not new employees, they've been there a long time, we wouldn't necessarily do the 6 months, but then it'll fold into the annual. So it really depends on how long that leave of absence is for us.
Okay, good. We're almost out of time. Do we have time for one more question?
We have one more.
Perfect.
It's microbiology competency. Are you showing competency for biochemical testing, such as latex or catalase?
Anybody able to take a micro question?
I feel like we probably are, but I don't know anything about our micro department. We're doing I know a lot of our IDs are on Maldi. So I don't know if we're doing any of those like chemical tests anymore, or if they're just culturing and then sticking it on the moldy top.
And
Yeah,
it's,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Serena.
It's the same for us at UCSF. I know that this question was coming in, so I went to our microbiology department to look at what they do for competency specifically. And again, I'm not seeing that, so either we're not doing that test, but I could see the MALFI being added and everything else.
Raven, do you have any input?
I wish I would have looked it up before this webinar, because I remember when we were creating system competency forms, which we 10 years ago we didn't, and we decided like, hey, we should have standard competency assessment forms. And I will tell you that a large part of our organization has outsourced microbiology. And so we do very, very little. We do gram stains, maybe blood culture incubation, very little. But we do have one laboratory still within the system that is full service micro. And I remember them coming to me and saying, we need help. We don't fit in this box of this, standard test system. And I cannot remember what we ended up doing. I don't think we ended up doing the individual biochemical test. I think it was really, we kind of did more of like, let's say like the life, like how you would work up, a sputum, and then, okay, we've done this, and then we would do that. So I don't think we did it at that biochemical level, but I'd have to go look what we ended up doing specifically for that lab, because they're kind of, like I said, they're our only micro lab in the system.
Yeah, I also spoke with our microbiology manager about this question. And, for a lot of things that are happening nowadays in microbiology labs, they're more like chemistry, hematology systems. But for something where it's perhaps a multi-hour or multi-day workup where you've got to grow things and then test them and then subculture or whatever you need to do, he said that what they're doing is that they review all of their cultures regularly so that they know from what's going on. And then I guess from there, perhaps maybe a documentation that this one was reviewed with the supervisor or manager on a particular day would probably suffice. So yeah, lots of things to think about with that. So we are out of time. Did we get the link for the training webinar into the chat for our participants, Jordan?
Yes, I did put that at the start of the webinar.
Okay, great. So thank you to our panelists for all of your insight. And it's always interesting to find out how things are done in other labs in other parts of the country. So I appreciate very much you participating, and also that you came back for round 2 on this. I love the continuity. And thank you to all of our participants. This will be, because it was recorded, it will be also available on the ADLM website. It might take a few days for that to go up, but it should be available. And I think it's available for a year. Is that correct, Jordan?
It'll be up for at least a year. Yes.
Yeah.
Could be longer.
Okay. Great. Well, for those of you who are at the end of the day, have a good evening. And for those of you who are in the middle of the day, I hope you have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
you.